innovators in the recruitment technology space and address the issues and ideas, the challenges and opportunities in the TA solutions industry. Now, as I suspect many of you know, we have a little athletic event going on here in the States and in Canada and in Mexico. But what you may not know is that a striker on the US side has a background that is the perfect metaphor for today's show. Valerian Balogun was born in Brooklyn of Nigerian parents and grew up in the UK. So he could have played for the Nigerian team, for the UK team, but luckily he chose to play for the US team. His diversity of employment opportunities, however, is the perfect representation of just how global talent is. And it sets the stage for today's discussion on going international, what job platforms get wrong. So please join me in welcoming our guest host for today's panel discussion, Bernie Deussner, founder and analyst at Blue Danube Advisors. Bernie, it's all yours.
Peter, thank you so much. It's great to be here. As Peter mentioned, my name is Bernie Deussner. I am the founder of Blue Danube Advisors, a boutique consulting and advisory firm in the HR tech and marketplace space. Before that, I spent 14 years at Indeed, leading international expansion across a number of markets in EMEA, APAC, and LATAM. And early this year, I held a keynote and participated at an industry conference over in Europe, actually, on international expansion and market selection strategy, which is actually where a lot of today's framing comes from. We're having some amazing panelists here today. And before I hand over to them, just a quick heads up that Sabashan from HeyMilo AI, who was supposed to join us as well, he unfortunately had a last-second conflict and won't be able to be here anymore. But I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about my own experience when it comes to expanding internationally and what can go wrong. When I was at Indeed, we didn't always get international right. We made some of the exact mistakes we're going to talk about today, but I had the luxury to learn from these mistakes and to improve for future expansion efforts. However, I do know that a lot of platforms don't have that luxury. So I want to use today's session to touch on some of the most critical areas for international expansion and hear from our panelists what they think. One of the mistakes that I've experienced is platforms tend to treat international as a distribution problem and just copy and paste the product and layout that works in their home country. But expanding internationally is fundamentally a go-to-market and commercial model problem. And what works in your home country often does not work abroad. Gerard, first of all, thanks for joining us and for being here. You're the CRO at Tellent and the former VP and Managing Director for EMEA at Indeed, where we had the pleasure of working together.
Yep.
You're in the trenches on go-to-market and the commercial side every single day. What's the one thing that companies almost always get wrong when they start selling into a new country?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, as you mentioned, lots of lessons learned from our journeys together, both at Indeed and other companies. I think for me, what often companies try to do is we try to solve for a local org chart as opposed to solving for a local buyer experience, right? So you think about things like, do we hire a local GM? Do we hire boots on the ground? Do we go centralized first? Do we open up in UK and Australia, English-speaking countries before we get into the more complex multilingual speaking areas of Europe and Asia and LATAM, right? So it's always these debates around what should the org and infrastructure look like, as opposed to where do the customers that we want to serve, where do they show up, how are they engaged and educated, and what is their willingness to buy and their brand awareness of what we have to offer. and what are the complexities within that locality that is going to create friction. And so things like, it's one thing to localize a website and localize a landing page. It's a whole different beast when you have to deal with compliance and multiple payment conditions and methods, as well as how you collect cash on the back end and manage, a different type of team locally. So really, it's about, for me, localize the customer facing edge. You can centralize an operational spine and keep them somewhat separate while you run in parallel. Things like invoicing and like your demand structure, enablement, like pull through your central marketing function, all those things can remain part of the spine. But then locally, you have to make sure that you're really thinking deeply about where your customer shows up, what they're already used to consuming in the market, and do you have a compelling reason for them to switch? And unless you have that tight and you can tell your story well, tell your story often, and tell your story better than what's in the marketplace, then you are going to end up with all of these local nuances that can just create inertia and slow you down. And we've seen it firsthand in various different growth loops that we had a point of view because the presentation and the planning said one thing, and then when you actually bring it to life on the ground, you get a completely different reaction. So I think they're the kind of things that I've seen that are really important. And the other piece I would say is knowing the economics of the kind of ROIs that you want to get, right? Whether it's conversion rates, win rates, CAC ratios, payback, how many months you want to spend burning cash, like having a point of view on these things and really looking at it regularly together with your central team and local team to keep yourselves honest. How long are you willing to continue on a path before you pivot off? And in some cases, you might have to wait until you're at that 90% in before it starts to turn. But in some cases along the way, you're going to have that emotional roller coaster of should we stay, should we pull out? And there's lots of reasons why you'll hear people telling you you should go and you should pull out or you should change. But sometimes you have to kind of stick to your bet and hold the line until you get there. And again, I've seen some companies where we pulled out prematurely before we got to the sweet spot. In other cases, we had to extend a little bit longer to give ourselves a bit more runway. And so they're just some of the things that are all, you can't expect a strategy deck to help you out until you're actually on the ground and learning as you go, and having that feedback loop with the team centrally as well is really important.
And we all know that there's always lots of opinions about when to go live, where to go live, how aggressively to invest, which areas to invest first. So yes, it's definitely more of an art than a science. But thank you so much for that intro. Another common mistake that I've seen over the years is underestimating the local incumbent. Every market has a player that already owns employer trust and job seeker habits, at least to a certain degree. The main question that companies, in my opinion, should ask themselves before expanding is, can we displace what's already there, and at what cost? Lou, also to you. Thank you so much for being here and welcome. You are the former VP of B2B marketing at Monster, which obviously was one of the original global job platforms.
Yeah, the OG.
You've seen, exactly, the OG. You've seen all the ups, all the downs tied to expansion in general, international expansion at scale. What would you say were your biggest takeaways from that experience at Monster?
So I think at Monster, it's really interesting. So I wasn't at Monster when they did their expanding, but I think I was working in recruitment marketing. I was a media buyer then. But I think what's really interesting, so I was thinking about this when we were talking about, planning this. And I think what's really interesting is what they got right is what you would call, it's kind of classic brand marketing stuff now. It's what you find there's two kind of well-known marketers called Byron Sharp and Mark Ritz, and they were recently at Cannes, and they were talking about things that they agreed on, and that some of the stuff that they were talking about, like building mental availability. So what Monster did really well was when it went into markets was making sure that enough candidates, because that was the primary audience for their messaging marketing when they went in, was making sure that enough candidates knew about them. So really building awareness, making sure that they had enough candidates coming in. And there's another thing that from a brand and marketing point of view as well, that they did well was kind of building out what's called now like distinctive brand assets, which is things that people recognize. So they kind of had different taglines through the years. They originally launched with a Super Bowl ad. They've had different taglines like, find better, your calling is calling. But what they did really well, and again, this was in a very different time as well. It's not so easy to recreate this now, but the principles are that you have to make sure that enough of your audience knows about you and that they think about you. And I think that what Monster didn't have was really big incumbents in those markets. So your point about making sure that what you need to know is, I think differentiation is really, really hard in the job board world these days. It wasn't so much when Monster was expanding, but now it's not necessarily much about differentiation, but it's about being distinctive. You've got to stand out and you have to stand for something. So what problem are you solving? I think to touch on what Gerard said as well, is that why are you needed in the market? What problem are you solving for candidates? So why will they come to you? Because if the candidates don't come to you, employers aren't going to come to you. And ideally, you want candidates choosing to come to you rather than it just being your programmatic advertising that's driving applications. So, being really clear on, you might have a good brand in your home market, but really understanding the DNA of what makes that work in your home market, and then how much of that is actually going to translate. Because work and being an employer, it's so socially coded. There are so many things that are completely different about it from one market to the next. So you have to understand all those local nuances, understand how you solve those problems. And the last thing that you want to do is you just don't want to sound like an outsider. One of the things I learned when I was at Monster, when we changed our product team and we only had product people in the US, and I managed the EU team, and the challenges that, even though we weren't expanding into any markets, I kind of had a crash course on how important the difference between translation and localization, and how important it is to just kind of understand all those little nuances, because the smallest little thing can just really stand out to people, like there's something a bit off with your site if you haven't got those things right. But if you can build mental availability, if people can think of you when they're looking for a job, that's what Monster got right. That's much harder to do these days, but it is still really important.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks for sharing. And a lot of what you just mentioned very much resonates about what I went through, and indeed what I think Gerard got exposed to as well. So yes, lots of truth to that. Those were a lot of good takeaways from different types of angles. Maybe a question for both of you. When a job platform says that they're going international, what do you think, or what would you say is the first thing that usually goes wrong? Like at the very beginning, what do you feel like is the mistake that lots of platforms are making? Is there something that comes to mind?
I'll
let you go, Gerard, if you've got anything you want to say.
I was going to let you go first, but I'm happy to do so. I think I think you can meet it with either like excitement or interpretation, right? Because you're thinking, okay, how many battle scars have you got when you hear that word, right? So it's kind of, I think in the start of my career, when I would look at it, I think, okay, it's looking at your TAM, it's thinking about your SAM, it's looking at the buyer mental availability, as Lou mentions, it's looking at the incumbents in the market and what have we got to disrupt. So there's excitement to that, and you kind of get a bit lost in maybe, the idea of where this could take you, and there's a level of maybe a little bit of interpretation. But then when you qualify a little bit more about, okay, let me understand what you mean by that. Like, let's go a level deeper to get the thinking, understand the rationale, what research has been done, and how much are we looking to invest in this. The biggest mistake that I see is that it's massively underinvested because it's being plugged into a giant spreadsheet with a lot of analysis, and it's all the right starting point, but it's taken with maybe a view by members of a team who never internationalized a business before. So they're very, very smart individuals who are very capable and very good at the planning piece of it. But where they lack is they haven't seen the movie, or they haven't had the battle scars. And so what you find is you'll notice maybe people will think of different names and brands as they go through this. But I know a number of brands who had big, local fanfares on LinkedIn and social media, and there was lots of talk about what they were going to do, and they were going to do lots of cool things in certain places. And 6-12 months later, all of a sudden it's very quiet. And then you hear about like maybe operators starting to reduce workforce or start to pull out of markets. So I think it's about really qualifying the depth of the research, understanding who's behind the plan, and has it been properly invested to actually work on the ground with somebody who's seen the movie. And I think that's the big thing, is a lack of experience. On the ground is where you see companies misfiring, or they're having to pivot 12, 24 months in and change an approach because they made some mistakes.
Yeah, I think what you said, Gerard, also ties back to, if you go into a new market or if you expand internationally first, there's a good chance that your leadership team has not experienced that first. And so there's always that scaredness of, hey, this does require some investment up front, and we're not turning this market profitable in month one, in quarter one, maybe not even year one. And so it's about coming up with a sound plan, sticking to the plan, and setting kind of goalposts along the way. Like, what are the metrics that actually matter to determine if we're making progress or not? And how can we get to where we want to be in year 2, year 3, year 5? So I totally agree with that. Coming up with that plan and sticking to it is critical.
Exactly. And we've been in meetings together where we're, 30 months deep, right, of burn rate, and we're still not seeing the profit, but we have a conviction. We know it's going to take another maybe 6-7 months for it to turn in our favor. But until then, you're tracking monthly UVs, you're tracking traffic, you're tracking application rates, you're tracking just general brand pickup. So you're tracking some of the leading indicators before revenue falls. But those meetings are kind of hot and heavy because people are looking left and right, wondering when's it gonna turn. And if you haven't got the conviction, then that's when some people could either pull out too soon or pivot direction and end up missing out on some of the prize at the end because they didn't stay on the course.
Yeah, absolutely. Lou, what's your take on the early mistakes?
I think that it's possibly being a bit inward focused, I would say as well, that thinking about why international expansion is great for you, but actually being really clear on, is there a market need there? Because it's a very crowded market for job boards. And so I think having that absolute crystal clear clarity about the role that you can play and why jumping into or moving into and expanding into a market that is likely already quite crowded. It's where's not the gap, but how are you going to stand out? And I think building on what Gerard said earlier, then the ex-media buyer in me does delight when people understand that you've got to invest in a lot of these things. How are you going to get the recognition? How are you going to reach the audience? In a fragmented media market, you don't get organic reach on social anymore. So there's a lot of investment to make, so it's, and that these things take a long time to pay back and to build up, but I think that going in with the clarity about why you're needed in the marketplace, where that need is absolutely essential, because, of course you can expand into a market and there is always a need for jobs, but is there a need for another job board? And I think that that's probably the thing I would focus on first.
Yeah, that differentiator, that value proposition to both sides of the marketplace. Like, what is the value prop to job seekers, and then what is the value prop to your prospects, your customers, employers, staffing firms, etc. So, very true.
And I think just even to share some other thoughts on that, Bernie, when we think about where the tech springboards have kicked in, right? So you kind of remember you got the classifieds to online search, then you got laptop search to mobile search. That was a big shift, right? Then you got the one-click apply or two-click apply. Who's the fastest to get the application and hold that attention piece? I think of like my daughter, she's now 19. when she was looking for a job, she was applying for jobs through social media links, hyperlinks, and she never looked on traditional job boards the way we would have done growing up. And so you look at the pace of that change, and now with LLMs and GEO and AEO, you're seeing now another shift again. So it's a little bit of using the technology swirl with your timing can also kind of springboard you into a kind of a market position when you get that timing right as well, I think. And particularly with the country you're picking, what's that nature on the ground in terms of their willingness to use technology and embrace these changes versus not. So very often you'd see companies who they like going into the Netherlands because the Dutch are always quite tech savvy and they always embrace new tools. Whereas if you prove it in the Netherlands, and maybe in 2 years' time, you might prove it in the DAC market. But then some like to try and be a challenger and go to the hardest market and think if we can break it there, we can break it anywhere. So I think the tech piece can also be a springboard for us.
Those countries are the exact example I usually use, where the Netherlands very open to new tech, shorter introductory sales cycles, and then you got Germany more on the conservative adoption side, longer trust building cycles before you can close a deal and convince customers as well as potential users to use your platform. Yep, very true. Maybe one that is for you, Gerard, from a revenue leadership perspective, and I think you hinted at that at the very beginning. How do you structure a team for international expansion without over localizing too early, or on the other hand, staying too global for too long? I know that is always a question about how local do you want to be versus how much do you want to keep in a central team or central place.
Yeah, I mean, I've done it a couple of different flavors over the years. I think one thing that I've seen work well is really where, again, you got a conviction that there's a problem to solve and that you have a real strong story of current use cases and current revenue and current customer base that prove that you have product market fit, right? So, you've got that established at least. Yes, the buyers might be different and some of the localization and the marketing brand awareness might differ, but you have to have at least 60-70% of a product market fit and a conviction of where you want to take that. That's part one. Part two then is trying to figure out like who's your seed team. Normally for me, the ideal seed team is a blend of a few different key people who you embed in the organization, right? I've had folks who were previously top customer success managers, maybe a top rep, maybe a top product person or product evangelist, maybe a top solutions engineer, for example. And I would have those 4 or 5 key folks be part of my original seed team, where I would then be the GM or VP of the group. And then we would start to build out our first wave of hires locally around that seed team. What the seed team gave me was they gave me legacy knowledge of the company and the process, policies, procedures, and how we do what we do, right? They also know where all the bodies are buried. So they're kind of like, oh, yeah, we had an issue like that before 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And here's how we solve for it. So you kind of have like a mini board of directors with you on the ground, which I found to be really helpful in 2 journeys I did. So having that seed team kind of part of the initial landing, maybe have them seconded for 2-3 years, ideally. It's also a great step up for people who want to experience a new lifestyle. Maybe they got a young family. So it's a nice way to retain top talent as well and kind of give them a new adventure. And then you got to parlay that then with the local hires on the ground, because naturally the local hires on the ground will come from either lookalike companies or adjacent businesses, and they have a certain awareness in the market that will help you balance your seed team. So when I did that in 2 of the previous lives, you ended up then embedding some of that central structure and culture, but also then making it uniquely local. And a lot of my kind of visitors from, in this case, would have been US companies who would have come out to meet with us as we were scaling 6 months, 12 months, 24 months into the journey. They were really surprised to see, oh, it feels like us, but different. And it's like, well, yeah, because we're taking some of the best in class lessons and we're parlaying it with the local knowledge on the ground. So that piece was interesting, having the kind of the seed support, and that can come in different variations. And then I think the other piece, which was really interesting, was we mentioned the DAC market earlier. Because there's markets that rely heavily on high trust, you got to be on the ground. If that means investing in local leadership and maybe one or two key hires locally with a small team, to be on the ground to do the first, demand generation and the first kind of face-to-face meetings and the first educational work, that might take 12, 16, 20 months to kind of build up, but it's work that's well spent. In my experience, you can't do that centrally. You can't do it too far from the market. And there's certain markets who will demand that of you to make sure you're a legitimate business, because they won't trust who you are, your credentials, unless you have, the local business infrastructure. So again, it's playing with the timing with that, making sure like the finance team are aware of what that means, getting the entities set up, getting the bank account set up, making sure there's proper funding, so that the company checks when they are done checkout, and people won't be confused as to, well, why are you saying you're French when you're not French, and you're routing revenue through the UK and back to the US kind of stuff. That gets people uncomfortable. So you want to make sure you have all these things in place to show that, hey, we are local, we have an entity, we have a few hires, we're paying our local taxes, and we're committed to the market. And straight away, that changes the attitude in people when they see that you're committed and you're building. And of course, you got to work through all of the different steps in earning trust, and that goes with that process. But getting some of those basic principles in place, I think, are really important. Seed team, parallel local versus central, and then making sure you have local credibility before you start to build. Because that goes a long way, particularly in the world of HR tech, when people all know each other and they all speak to each other. You can't just be coming in and, trying to upset the status quo and do things that are uncommon in the local network, because it will put you back.
Yeah. You don't want to look like a tourist where you do things half-baked and then decide, oh, do I want to do more? Do I want to do less? You want to show the market and your customer base that, hey, I'm here for the long run. I'm here to be a partner to you and your business. So Let's do this together and figure out what are the best solutions for everyone involved.
Exactly. And even the fact that Lou came from, Monster, that was a verb for us in the industry, right? And so I worked with a lot of colleagues from Monster who came to Indeed for that same reason, because they brought customers who they knew for many years on the ground with them to Indeed. So it's that personal relationship that you're also buying into, that you just can't get cold from a shiny website or a lovely brand campaign. Like, you're talking 12, 15, 16 years of relationships that go deep. And in many cases, a lot of customers who change companies, they bring you with them as well, as we know. So it's not just a one and done like annual contract and that's it. It's very much multiple years of relationships that exist within this ecosystem as well.
Absolutely. That's a good transition. Lou, Monster, obviously, we touched on this already, was one of the first global platforms that really try to engage customers, engage job seekers on a global level. But from when you joined, what did winning internationally actually look like from a marketing, from a branding perspective? And is there anything, looking back, that you would do differently nowadays?
Yeah, I guess the winning internationally. Well, when I was there, we weren't. Wasn't. I joined in 2018, so we weren't doing a lot of expanding then. But what we were really looking at then was there'd been some fragmentation between the regions, and so it was about bringing consistency to the brand globally, whereas actually a lot of countries had been run quite separately. When I joined, the UK had done a TV ad that I think had gone to a couple of other countries, but not to others. And so it was trying to bring that kind of consistency to the brand voice back. And that was where there was a lot of lessons learning on that. I think that one lesson, which is something I think as well that's really interesting, is when people leave and things turn over, it's about the loss of knowledge in an organization when it's been going for quite a long time. And so how important it is actually to kind of keep documenting some of these things. But as we were trying to bring it back together, it was about how do you have a cohesive brand that we're saying the same things in each market, but we're saying it in the way of that market. And there was a tagline that we had that key learning for me was around, because I don't speak other languages, so there was a lot of skilling up for people in this, but we had a tagline, find the right fit, which actually you may well realize, Bernie, but in German it just doesn't work very well to translate. You actually, that it needs to be contextually translated. And so there were things like this, and what we were trying to do was look at how do you, for us winning men, how do we have the efficiency and effectiveness of a global team, but you have the, you've got that kind of localization, and that was made more difficult when we moved to only having a US based product team. And I think what we lost there then was particularly because product and marketing are the product team looked after the site and the marketing team looked after everything that drove it to there. But when you're talking about the site, that's such a big marketing element, even though it was owned, it's owned by the product team. But it was about how do you then scale? How do you then scale that? You've got to have someone who owns the site in each language to make it as persuasive as possible. So that was there was a lot of, as we were changing as a company and we were trying to move things in. I think at one point Monster had ended up with 27 different sites, and we were, how do we bring this into it all being a much more streamlined tech organization? And there was a lot of moving around. We changed things, but the key thing for us was that for us, it was about efficiency and effectiveness, but everything needed to feel like it was locally, like it had been developed locally, like that someone in the native language had developed this because it needed to look and feel and be culturally relevant to get as much cut through as possible. One thing we were very lucky with was that the Monster brand was still really strong. So in the UK, we showed up on both Randstad, and I heard from the Indeed UK marketing director that Monster still showed up on the brand tracker. He told me that last year, that Monster still showed up on the brand tracker, and we hadn't done any TV advertising for a long time. So it does go to show that if you can build these things up, that getting that bit right, getting recognized with the right audience. Now, I will admit that was with an older audience, maybe not so much with the younger audience, but really it's about, for us, it was about brand guardianship and then trying to extend that. But yeah, from a global point of view, it was, how do you make it as efficient as possible while still looking and feeling like it's all been developed by a local, like a local marketing team or a local marketing agency?
Yeah, it's the art of being consistent, yet being local. And I've experienced teams that ran a brand campaign for the US in Australia with the same creative content, and then there was surprised that it didn't resonate as much in Australia as it did in the US. So I think you summarized that very well. I want to be mindful of time. Before I let both of you go, I would love to get one hot take from each of you without any it depends, or here's a caveat. So if a platform is launching in a new country, let's say next quarter, what is the single most important thing they should do? Gerard, do you want to start?
I think given everything is AI and LLM right now, be very cautious with what that means in your service and your offering, right? Because unless you've got solid foundation, AI flavor will just augment, garbage in, garbage out. So you gotta be super careful that you don't fall into that trap. I see lots and lots of players right now coming into the HR tech world, offering and promising all kinds of wonderful technology advances around AI, and in some cases it will improve workflow, it'll save time, it'll improve matching, it'll improve speed and whatnot. But when I'm speaking to customers that I serve, there's definitely a hesitation and all about job seeker, privacy and fairness and compliance. And so, yeah, that's something we got to be careful of, and just in terms of making sure the fanfare, we don't lose sight of who we're serving and why we do what we do. And that's the piece I would say. Anything around a generic experience with AI, if you don't have the fundamentals right about why you're entering the market and your value prop, then that will simply augment the problem, and you'll end up having to unwind that pretty quickly when you end up in areas you didn't plan to be in. So that's something that's on top of my mind right now, given there's so many different players who are trying to enter with the same value prop.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Lou, what's the non-negotiable for you?
So I would say it's picking back up on something Gerard said earlier about, companies getting too caught up in the org chart, and I can see how that absolutely would be a problem. But I would say that I think the thing that you absolutely need to have is people. Now, they don't need to be employees, maybe they are contractors, but I think you need to have people who are responsible, who know the market inside out, and they can own what your voice is in that market. They're the ones that makes a final decision, because you will get feedback. If you launch something, you might get feedback from employers that some phrasing might be wrong, or some things like that. So who is the person that you go to, and not just from a marketing point of view, but who owns your voice in the market and takes ownership for language, how things get translated, but understanding the cultural nuances, and almost like a cultural attaché type, that you have someone who completely understands the market and can tell you these things. But that wouldn't just be guiding brand, that would be guiding product, how you talk about, if you're going into France, you're going into Paris, you need to have someone who can help you understand the arrondissements, or make sure that you know that when you're changing your addresses in the UK, we have 4 countries, but we're still one country, as well as how you localize things. And I think there has to be someone who is responsible for that, like a point of approval in the company that can tell you that these things are correct, and that that means they need to have grown up in that country, native understanding of it. I would think that that's absolutely essential. And if that's a contractor, someone you work with for a year, who can advise you on those things, because there'll be so many of those little things that will trip you up.
Yeah, I would second that. I think having someone who knows the market, who is senior, who knows the commercial cycles, who knows the industry players, who knows potential customers, it's critical. You want to stay true to your business, to your brand, but then bringing someone in who understands the local market is critical. So yes, I definitely would second that. Great. Well, before I let you go, where can people find you if someone wants to get in touch? What's the best way to connect? Gerard?
Yeah, I mean, look, I work for Tellent, who's a European HR tech platform. I'm available on LinkedIn and happy to connect with anyone who's interested in either hearing more about what we have to offer, or in general, how to scale up operations and take these things to the next level. So LinkedIn is probably the best.
Amazing. Lou?
Yeah, LinkedIn for me as well. So I can just see that. I think Stephen has very kindly popped that into the chat for me. Yeah, LinkedIn for me. Reach out me on there, or you can find me on email. I've got my company page on there, so just get in touch on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. I think this was a great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It did feel a little rushed, even though you think 30 minutes is a lot, or almost 40 minutes in this case. But no, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to growing a business internationally. Gerard, Lou, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being direct, sharing your perspectives and your experience. And I also want to take a minute to thank Peter and the TAtech team for allowing me to put this together. If you want to dig deeper into international expansion strategies, find me on LinkedIn as well, and we would all love to chat. So thank you again, and I hope to see everyone next time.